Turn your Bibles to Revelation chapter 6, and I'm going to read verses 1 through 17. I want to invite you to engage your imagination, just to be aware of what your mind is imagining as we're reading this, because this is a pretty a picturesque chapter, and so you use your imagination. And I'm doing it on purpose this way first, because I do have slides depicting things later, but I'd rather right now that you use your own imagination first, because God's created us and given us the wonderful capacity of creative imagination. Chapter 6, verse 1. I watched as the Lamb opened the first of the 7 seals. Then I heard one of the 4 living creatures say in a voice like thunder, "Come." I looked, and there before me was a white horse. Its rider held a bow, and he was given a crown, and he rode out as a conqueror built on conquest. When the Lamb opened the 2nd seal, I heard the 2nd living creature say, "Come." Then another horse came out, a fiery red one. Its rider was given power to take peace from the earth and to make people kill each other. To him was given a large sword. When the Lamb opened the 3rd seal, I heard the 3rd living creature say, "Come." I looked, and there before me was a black horse. Its rider was holding a pair of scales in his hand. Then I heard what sounded like a voice among the 4 living creatures saying, 2 pounds of wheat for a day's wage, and 6 pounds of barley for a day's wage, and do not damage the oil and the wine. When the Lamb opened the 4th seal, I heard the voice of the 4th living creature say, "Come." I looked, and there was a pale horse. Its rider was named Death, and Hades was following close behind him. They were given power over 1/4 of the earth to kill by sword, famine, and plague, and by the wild beasts of the earth. When he opened the 5th seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain because of the word of God and the testimony they had maintained. And they called out with a loud voice, "How long, sovereign Lord, holy and true, until you judge the inhabitants of the earth and avenge our blood?" Then each of them was given a white robe, and they were told to wait a little longer until the full number of their fellow servants, their brothers and sisters, were killed just as they had been. I watched as he opened the 6th seal. There was a great earthquake. The sun turned black like sackcloth made of goat hair. The whole moon turned blood red, and the stars in the sky fell to earth, as figs drop from a fig tree when shaken by a strong wind. The heavens receded like a scroll being rolled up, and every mountain and island was moved or removed from its place. Then the kings of the earth and the princes, the generals, the rich, the mighty, and everyone else, both slave and free, hid in caves and among the rocks of the mountains. They called to the mountains and the rocks, "Fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who can withstand it?" What a chapter. What if after this reading we close service and I just sent you home with no comment? You're like, okay, what did I just hear? What is this all about? Well, that's what we're going to try to dive into. It's interesting that the Lamb opens all 6 of these seals in chapter 6. And I believe that it is the beginning of the revelation, the unveiling of things to come. And it's fascinating that the first 4 seals begin with an invitation to John to come. The four horses of the apocalypse, as is often called, they represent reality, and each color, I think, is easily identified, and certainly there's a lot of agreement as to this. But the white represents victory, red is blood, black is famine, and the pale equals death. Now, one thing that's fascinating is, and when I read this and thought about it this week and sort of pushed it aside, I noticed there are several things not in this chapter. And that's what doesn't help us, because there's some things missing. First of all, we don't know the time frame when this is supposed to happen. The only time frame we have, think about this, is in the beginning of the book of Revelation, chapter 1, and the last chapter, where we came across that phrase where John says very clearly, these are things that must shortly come to pass. Now, what do you do with that when you come to chapter 6? There's a wide range of how people have taken this. If you look at chapter 6 and what's going on, parallel to Matthew 24, which and also Mark 13, which they call the little book of Revelation, but both of those messages are Jesus talking about two things together: when the temple is going to be destroyed and when the Son of Man comes again. And it's fascinating that when he talks about the Son of Man coming again, Jesus is very clear. Even the Son of Man doesn't know that timetable, only the Father. That's fascinating to me. For the rest of it, with the fall of Jerusalem in Matthew 24 and Mark 13 being referenced, Jesus is clear that this is going to happen within the current generation. Okay, so some people, because of the parallels, and there's a ton, I've got at least 7 exact parallels between Matthew 24 and Revelation 6, but because of those exact parallels, some people think that these events in chapter 6 of Revelation were going to also happen within the lives of the current readers of John. So you have people believing within the lifetime of John, but then throughout history, Christian interpretation has said on the other end that this applies to the very end time. That when all 6 of these happen, that's when Christ is going to come. That's another view. Then, of course, there's the view that in different times of history, you can look at Christian history and see all of these signs unfolding. So I don't know the complete answer to that. The time is not given in chapter 6. So maybe we need to leave it open with the idea that there was both a direct reference to John's readers, but a reference to us. So keep that in mind, because that's what we don't have in this chapter. When you look at Revelation 6 compared with Matthew 24, both start off with the recognition there's going to be some false messiahs and false Christs come along. Now, I want you to hang on to that, because when we get to the different horses, I want to talk about this in a moment. Number 2, both mention wars. In Revelation 6, Matthew 24, there's time of war and desolation. Number 3, both mention famine, times of famine. Number 4, there's the reference to pestilence. And we'll talk about what pestilence is and what it means, because in the ancient world, it was a strong term. The 5th thing, both Revelation 6 and Matthew 24 have in common, is a mention of specific persecutions. Then there's another common thing that they share. In Revelation 6, there's the picture of an earthquake, a solar eclipse, a blood red moon, and stars falling. Okay? Well, in Matthew 24, there's a solar and lunar eclipse. Heavenly bodies are shaken. So it sounds a lot similar. The last thing, which is interesting, in chapter 8, verse 1, we'll get to the place where, after all these seals are unsealed, there's a heavenly silence. And in Matthew 24, there's the implication that there's a silence on earth because the Son of Man is going to appear. And apparently that means the last appearing. So these two correlations between the first 6 seals and Jesus' prediction of events to be fulfilled within a generation tells me that just like, now think about this, and this isn't strange to think about, just like the message to the 7 churches was directly applicable to those 7 churches, and here's what made me think about saying it this way, because part of Larry's prayer, I don't know if you caught this, but Larry's prayer was that I have a lesson that's applicable to us today. Okay? Well, Revelation is a real challenge, isn't it? Because we don't have time frames. Boy, I wish we had. You know what's been so neat about the book of Revelation? If at the end of it, the Lord had produced a calendar with dates on it. And that would have been neat, but we don't have that. We don't have that. So just as the 7 letters were written to the 7 churches, and we as the church today can learn from that, these 6 seals, I think, were to be demonstrated within the life of the believers that John's writing to, but also it speaks to our day and time. And we're going to look at some of those powerful parallels. So let's start off with the first white horse. And I will confess, on this horse, I am stumped. Because I've done tons of reading by different Christian writers. And there are people who say that the one on the white horse is Jesus. But then there are others who say that it's the Antichrist or the false Messiah who's on the white horse. I don't know how to resolve this. I do know that the writer holds a bow. He's given a crown, which represents victory. He wrote out as a conqueror, but he's also bent on continuing conquest, which means the intent is fierce and it's focused. Some say that the writer is a false prophet, that in the name of Satan, he is conquering and continues to have victories over humanity. The other view says that this rider on the white horse is the invincible Lord. Here's what, 2 things that I just really struggling with. In the book of Revelation, and here certainly with the horses, remember we talked about the value of recognizing color, okay? The color white typically represents purity, victory. There are other words you can associate that. So if you go that route, then I could see why people say that this one seated on the horse could represent Jesus. Now, the other side of it is that the other 3 seals that are open with the other 3 horses are calamities upon the face of the earth. And so some people would say, well, this is the first horse that is riding off into the sunset, so to speak, with the bow, getting ready to unleash the rest of the calamities in the other 3 seals with the 3 horses. I'm going to leave this to your judgment. I'm going to let you struggle with it because I had to struggle with it. I don't know the answer to it. And when you read Christian commentators, they're divided. They're on both sides of the issue. It is interesting that it does come in chapter 6 where the seals are beginning to be open. I could lean toward the fact that this one that's on the white horse is the one that's getting ready to open up all the calamities upon earth. Okay? So there's that white horse. Another thing that sort of is interesting to me, I'm wondering if when John used this white horse imagery, that his readers very easily understood what he meant. I'm sure that they did. It's just that we're 2,000 years later and we don't have all the information we need. Another factor to think about, that this could be an emissary of Satan with the white horse and on the bow. In the ancient world, emperors would ride on white stallions with a crown, and it was to show power and authority. And so some have thought that maybe this represents the Roman emperor that's on the horse ready to go out and conquer. So anyway, throw that out for you to think about, because John doesn't give us more information. Fortunately, we get a little bit more specific on the other horses that we can deal with. Horse number 2 is the red horse. That red horse is given power. And I found this fascinating too, because I picked up on this week. Things are given to. So the power here is to take peace from the earth, power to make people kill each other, and to him was given a large sword. Now, we don't know who gave the large sword to the rider on the red horse. The implication is it's sort of like what we call divine permission. God allowed this to happen, that this red horse, this rider, was given a large sword. War that was and is to fall upon the earth to take away the peace of humanity. Bloodshed. I want you to think about, and we're going to talk about the flip side of this coin a little bit in our lesson. I want you to think about all that Satan has done throughout human history that has caused bloodshed and hatred and death that was not in God's original plan. Seals 2, 3, and 4, riders on the horses, 2, 3, and 4, are often portrayed together as instruments of divine judgment upon the earth. And it's not that unusual, because there is Old Testament precedent for this. Jeremiah 14:12, the Lord says, I will destroy them with the sword, famine, and plague. And you can compare other passages like Ezekiel 6 with the prophetic utterance that when God's people, this is the prophets, when God's people weren't faithful, he said to them through the prophets, I'll destroy them with the sword, famine, and plague. Now, what's interesting is this note of destruction by the red horse comes at a time when the unthinkable happens in Rome. You may have heard of the phrase, the Pax Romana, which means the peace of Rome. The Roman emperors were very proud of this peace of Rome, that for so many years, the Roman Empire had power and it was stable, and they were proud of that. Well, not too many years from when John's writing, that Pax Romana disappears, and it's replaced by anarchic internal strife and destruction, so that the Roman Empire is destroyed from within. And so what you have here is the red horse as a recognition that it's a time of judgment upon the Roman Empire, which raises the question, does God ever judge a nation? That's a fascinating question, doesn't it? I've heard a lot of people today, and you've heard this too. I don't know how you can prove this, but there's strong messages that I see today that things that we experience in our country, like disease, death, all the different horrible things that we see in the news, are part of God's judgment upon the nation. Now, I don't know how to claim that. I think you could say that. The problem is we don't have divine revelation like the prophets did, so we can't say it with the same surety. But there are ways and times where it's pretty clear that consequences we see in our culture are because of sin that's been engaged. And we see that over and over. Now, we move from the red horse to the black horse. This black horse is holding a pair of scales in his hand. This balance represents divine judgment. You may remember Daniel declared to King Belshazzar in the book of Daniel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. That's exactly what this horse is. And in that description, there's a description of 2 pounds of wheat for a day's wages, 6 pounds of barley for a day's wages. Now, it depends on your English translation. It's hard to know. Some people think of it in terms of kilos, some in terms of pounds because of we're English in America. But it's recognizing, as best we can tell, 8 to 16 times of what things should cost normally. It became a time of terrible inflation. However, there's an interesting phrase at the end of the verse. Do not injure or damage the oil and the wine. What does that mean? Well, that would be a reference to the injury of the inflation. And some people take it to mean this, that those who were well off and lived by the oil and wine, which is a reference to rich, the rich kept on living rich. The poor, however, once the Roman Empire started to fall, the poor really had a hard time because things became inflated and they couldn't hardly survive. And so what you have is this black horse, this third horseman initiates famine, Roman prosperity across the board is replaced with food rationing. The wealthy live as usual, but the crisis hurts the poor. And this is being unleashed on the Roman Empire. Then number 4 is the pale horse. Its rider is named Death, and it says Hades is following close behind him. So I don't know if Hades is running along behind him or if Hades is on another horse behind him. He doesn't say, but he said he's following close behind him. And they were given a power over the fourth of the earth to kill by sword and famine and plague and by the wild beasts of the earth. The pale colors suggest persons that are sick to the point of death and even corpses, the color pale. And death and Hades are pictured as being on the prowl for victims. And although the two are depicted here as destroying forces on the earth, Jesus has already declared his spiritual authority over death and Hades. Remember back in chapter 1? He's already overcome them. This same dreadful fourfold judgment was once promised to idolatrous Jerusalem. Listen to Ezekiel. Again, this falls within a real strong prophetic tradition. For this is what the Lord, sovereign Lord, says. How much worse will it be when I send against Jerusalem my fourfold dreadful judgment? Sword, famine, wild beasts, and plague. That's from Ezekiel. To kill its men and their angels. The followers of Jezebel, remember back in chapter 2, verse 23. Remember the expression, I will kill them with death? The idea of being killed with death carries with it the meaning of pestilence. People were afraid of pestilence. Today, let me give a good parallel. Even as advanced as we live in a day and time with medical science, wasn't it fascinating how fearful people still were of COVID? Here we live in a day and time. We think we are medically advanced. And in many ways, we sort of are. I'm thankful for medical science. But boy, when COVID hit, there was a lot that medical science didn't know. And the fear that we kind of experienced as a nation, that was typical all the time in the ancient world. Anytime pestilence came into the picture, there was a lot of fear. 2 historical notes about this. In the summer of 65 AD, when Nero was persecuting the church, in Rome alone, there was a plague that broke out and it killed 30,000 residents that summer in Rome. Pestilence also broke out in Jerusalem because of overcrowding when the Romans, remember the Roman Emperor Titus, when they put the siege on Jerusalem in AD 70, there was a huge pestilence that broke out just in the city of Jerusalem because of the siege. So in the ancient world, pestilence was always seen as divine judgment and visitation. When we open seal number 5, Under the altar of the souls, we can hear individuals crying out with a loud voice. And I'm going to assume a couple of things, that one of the driving factors of this whole chapter is this question. See, because you can look at it and go, wow, all this stuff's going on. What's really behind all this? I think it's this. They called out in a loud voice, "How long, sovereign Lord, holy and true, until you judge the inhabitants of the earth and avenge our blood?" It's kind of like this thinking. Lord, look what we've been through. We've been through this for you. What are you going to do about it? Avenge our blood. In the book of Revelation, there is a strong message that for Christians, even when you see brothers and sisters die for their faith, keep the faith, knowing the Lord has the last say. He will avenge that blood. It's a strong message of hope. It is designed for Christians to have their faith not shaken. Oh, in the next seal, we're going to see some stuff shaken here. But faith not to be shaken because you see what's happening to Christians around you. As you know, there are Christians around the world that still today are martyrs, and they're dying for their faith. We probably are not aware as much as we should be. I recently read that in the 20th century, the last 100 years that we've just come through, we're now in the 21st century. In the 20th century alone, more Christians throughout the world were martyred than the rest of all the years of Christian history. And now, because we live in America and we feel blessed and kind of safe somewhat, we don't live in other countries. We don't see often what's going on. And the news doesn't, you're not going to see that in the evening news. They're not going to tell you. Like, there's not this running count on the evening news. Oh, guess what? Overseas, 10 more Christians died today. Well, there's not a running count on the evening news of Christians being martyred. They just don't do that. And so often we as Christians are not aware of how many Christians continue to die for their faith. Okay? So that's what drives this question. It's one for those souls that are under the altar, who have lost their life. They've been slain because of the word of God and the testimony they maintained. I love that expression. Even being threatened with their life, they said, we're not changing. Now, the question then for us today is this: do we have that kind of strong faith that even if we were threatened with death, we would say, without hesitation, do what you got to do. I'm not changing. I'm ready to die right here and now for my Lord, knowing that he will avenge. He'll have the last say. Each of them was given a white robe. They were told to wait a little longer. And this is a fascinating insight too. I pondered on this until the full number of their fellow servants were killed just as they had been. There's some kind of sovereign determination and big plan going on that we don't know. But this is part of the message of encouragement. He's saying something like this: now, those of you who have seen all these Christians die, they're crying out to the Lord. He's noticing their sacrifice, but guess what? There is going to be a certain number that will die because of that. Now, they're not given the number right here, but there's going to be a certain number. And it's supposed to be a message of assurance that God knows what's going on and his hand is at work. And you may not see it right now. His hand is at work. Then there comes this tremendous cosmic apocalyptic imagination. There's a great earthquake. I found a picture where the author tried to put all these together in one, which again raises the question, like I said, are these events occurring all at once, or are they one at a time? Most people think they're probably, at least in the vision itself, occurring all at once. There's a great earthquake. The sun turns black. The whole moon turns red. You may be familiar with the teaching and the thinking about what's it called, the blood moons. There's something about signs of the red moon and Jesus supposed to be coming. I don't know how you determine that. I respect the idea that, yeah, Christ is coming and we need to be ready, but I would be very uncomfortable saying that a certain amount of red moons is the determining factor when Christ is going to come. I don't know how you calculate that. How would you do that? John certainly doesn't do it. He just says this is the picture of the moon turned to blood red. The stars in the sky fell to earth as fig trees drop from a fig tree when shaken by a strong wind. We've got hickory nut trees in our backyard, and sometimes in the spring, we get strong enough wind, they fly everywhere. You just hear hickory nuts hitting everything. So when I read this, I thought, oh yeah, I've seen that happen. You know, all these fruit with a strong wind just fall right off the tree, and that's like the stars falling out of the sky to the earth. And the heavens receded like a scroll being rolled up. Every mountain and island was removed from its place. So those who are confronted with this, they cry out, they want to hide us from the wrath of the Lamb. And then notice how the question ends at verse 17, who can withstand it? In Matthew 24, there's the same thing about people fleeing to the mountains and saying, oh, the mountains are going to fall on us. And that's a reference to the fall of Jerusalem. Again, some people think that this is the apocalyptic language, imagination, being used to talk about the fall of Jerusalem. If it is, then that gives us an early date for the book of Revelation. If it isn't, it may be a later date for writing. John is in Ephesus in 96 AD and later. But it still raises the question, or it makes us recognize two things here. In this seal number 6, Christians don't have to be afraid of the wrath of the Lamb. We don't have to run and hide, okay? Don't have to be fearful. Number 2, the answer to the question, who can stand? The only ones that can stand are those that are with the Lamb, even if it's at the point of losing your head, the point of martyrdom. Who can stand? We know exactly who can stand. But if you don't follow the Lamb and you're fearful and you're going to run away and you want the mountains and everything to fall on you, that is not a good future to look forward to, is it? So, as we end the lesson, what do we make of these 6 seals? Perhaps it's the 4 horsemen, and if we put the white horse in the middle of this, they're riding forth with evil intent upon the earth. And we think of the opposite of each one of these for the good news of the gospel that I believe John is trying to encourage his readers with. And we may miss it if we don't stop and think about it. Jesus is our conqueror, and he's stronger than anything Satan can send out. Number 2, remember the red horse was for shed blood? Well, Christ shed his blood for our spiritual and eternal welfare. And as Christians, we may have to shed our own blood. Number 3, the redemptive suffering is such that souls are fed with manna from above. Remember we talked about the famine, the physical hunger, the pestilence, all of that. Well, when we look at suffering, we know that it's not going to be forever on this earth. And souls are fed with manna from above. And then number 4, death and Hades have already been conquered. It may look like that it's, they're out riding on the horse, doing whatever they want, just to inflict damage and destruction upon all of humanity. But John even starts out in chapter 1, the Lord's already conquered them, so we don't have to be afraid. So, in a world full of calamities and woes and suffering and evil plans going forth, people ask, where is God and what is he going to do? And the writer, John, in Revelation 6, is very clear in answering that. God is a sovereign Lord. He's in control of the big picture, and he will avenge. He will stand up and vindicate his people for their faithfulness. God and the Lamb are in control. The blood of Jesus is our propitiation so that we don't have to face the wrath of the Lamb, and we're hidden from that wrath. These seals have a twofold purpose. They show God's unfolding plan on the earth, and they're designed to give comfort to God's people who are having a really hard time. This world is not going to be left to Satan's devices. In fact, it's interesting. You will see this all through Revelation. Remember, he said that there's only a quarter of the earth where there'll be people die and there'll be these other things happen on the earth. There are different ways all through Revelation that two things are said about Satan, and we need to emphasize these over and over and over again. Satan is not all powerful. And so when you look at these seals, even the destructive power that he mentions, it's not complete, not over the whole earth. It's a quarter of the earth. Satan's not all powerful. And guess what? Satan's not going to always be doing his bidding. His time, his power and his time are limited. And that's what these seals are saying. And we need to hear the power of that message. So this morning, do you have the kind of faith and kind of walk with the Lord that no matter how hard times get, can you maintain your faith and say, do what you got to do, Satan. I'm not afraid of you. The Lord's already conquered you. I'm here with you, my Lord. So without him, we cannot make it and we cannot live.